Oh, hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'm back in some guest quarters today because they're doing some renovations on the ship, and I can't get into my own quarters, so I won't be there for a little while. But these are nice quarters, and it's a good opportunity for me to talk to you a little bit about the 1840s. Now, I think the 1840s are a time that is kind of overlooked in U.S. history, but I think it's a really big time, uh, an important time that too often gets overlooked. It's the period that we often refer to as kind of the middle of manifest destiny, and it's the period of the Polk presidency. The Polk presidency is a controversial presidency. But I think that it is important to talk about. So let's dig right in, and we'll talk about the Polk presidency and the other stuff that's going on in the 1840s. Before we get to Polk, we need to talk a little bit about Tippecanoe and Tyler too. You remember that when we last left politics, we were talking about the idea of Harrison being elected, and then Harrison dies 4 weeks into his presidency. And so his vice president, John Tyler, will take the presidency for most of those 4 years, the overwhelming majority of those 4 years. And Tyler is an interesting character. Tyler, like many vice presidents, is chosen to draw in a particular demographic of voter, not necessarily for their ability to lead. And what happens is Tyler will get crossways with his own political party, the Whigs. They called him a Democrat in Whig clothing because of some of the decisions that he's made. And he's basically shut out of politics by the leading politicians in the Senate and House of Representatives during this time. And so he himself doesn't get a lot done, but there's a lot that goes on during that time period. And the big issues that we're looking at during this time period is still the bank. You remember that the bank has been kind of in chaos since the Jackson era and his pet banks. And so the big debate around banks during this time period is, should we have another Bank of the United States that has lending power to encourage manufacturing? Or should we have just a treasury that holds the money of goods money coming into the federal government and doesn't have that lending power? So you can imagine that the southern states, the more agricultural, agrarian states, want an independent treasury, and the more industrial states in the north want a new U.S. bank. So this is the big rub in the Tyler administration, and it doesn't get worked out during this time. Okay, it'll be the Polk administration that will begin to mess with all that. The second issue is the tariff, and the tariff is a big issue and has been since the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. Again, it is kind of a sectional issue. The North wants higher protective tariffs. The South wants lower tariffs to encourage trade and not artificially raise prices. And so this becomes a big battle. And so we'll see what happens under the Polk administration with that. Internationally, we have some issues with England. England does not like what we are doing, kind of asserting ourselves. England is having some spats with some folks in Canada, and the United States is kind of caught, or some people in the United States, not the United States government, is caught supplying arms to those kind of rebels in something called the Caroline Incident. This causes a real tension between the United States and Great Britain. There are these volleys of letters and letters to the editor going back and forth. And one of the issues has to do with border disputes between Canada and the United States. And one of these will really erupt into I wouldn't call it a full-scale war, but a type of war in the late 1830s. And it has to do with where the boundary with Maine is. Where does that boundary of the United States end, and where does it begin with Canada? And so what happens is there is some fighting. It's mainly among the lumberjacks that are up there, and it will finally die down in 1842 with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which will define the modern boundary of Maine as it is today. In addition, Texas, that we've kind of already talked about, is really heating up. That issue is really heating up. You remember last time we talked about Moses Austin, who was negotiating with Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna and negotiated for 300 families to go to Tejas, the Tejas part of Mexico. And then Moses will die, and his son, Steve Austin, will take those families and their slaves, notably, to that area. And you remember that caused a big issue in the late 1820s, around 1830, when Mexico outlaws slavery. And to add to the complexity of all this, there had been lots and lots and lots of illegal immigration from the United States to Mexico, bringing slaves illegally into the country. And so you remember when we left off, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led troops up to enforce Mexican law in Texas. The Texans start talking about their inherent rights and that sort of thing, rights to own property, and that property are human beings. Let's be clear. And so that's what caused the Mexican War, or this Texas War for Independence is what it was called. And that happened in 1836. So right when all this is happening. And then you can go back and read about what happened there, but essentially what happens is Texas will gain its independence, but there still is a disputed border between Mexico and Texas. And there are two rivers. There's the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, and that's where we will see the next kind of big explosion of conflict in all of this. Okay, so that's happening, and at the same time, by the time we get to the 1840s, Texas will once again be asking for statehood, and that becomes a huge issue. They ask for statehood when they get independence in 1836, but 1836 is an election year, and it's just it would upset the balance in the Senate. Remember, that's the big issue in this time period, is the balance in the Senate. They thought that would, Texas assumed they would just be welcomed into the United States. They weren't. They became their own country after the War for Independence in 1836, and for 9 years they are what was called the Lone Star Republic. And so that's what's going on. By the time we get into the mid 1840s and get close to the election of 1844, Tyler has worked really hard to get Texas admitted into the Union. And early in 1845, Texas will become part of the United States. But as happens between 1820 and 1850, right on the heels of Texas coming in, there is a northern state, a non-slave state, that comes in to maintain that balance in the Senate. And so that is all going on as we move toward the election of 1844. And in 1844, the Democrats don't really have an odds-on candidate. They've dabbled in several candidates and that sort of thing. But when they have their convention, there is a man from Tennessee, James K. Polk, that will kind of wow everybody. And he's called a dark horse candidate because he kind of comes out of nowhere, and he becomes their candidate, and he ends up winning the election. He pledges to do 4 things. And those 4 things are to lower the tariffs, to build an independent treasury, to get more land for the United States to extend slavery, and this would be the Southwest, from, say, what's California today to into New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, that area. So that's what he wants, and he pledges to get the Oregon country from England. And so those are the 4 things that he pledges to do. These are all very Southern-leaning issues, and so the South really rallies around him, and the Southwest rallies around him, and he is elected in 1844, takes office in 1845, and he is one of the few presidents that will get all 4 campaign promises done in 4 years. Unfortunately for him, he was on the wrong side of history, but he does get these 4 things done. So let's talk about the 4 things that he gets done in his presidency, ending with the Mexican War. So let's talk about tariffs, first of all. He will encourage Congress to lower tariffs, and there will be a lowering of tariffs, which is really popular for the southern states. And part of what allows him to do this is that he offers to lower tariffs on goods that the North is spending more money on, and so that helps. But the first thing is that he lowers tariffs. The second thing is that he builds an independent treasury. And you remember the whole hubbub around banks, right? This kind of, for the short term, ends that controversy and will end on the side of the independent treasury. And then there is the Oregon question. Now, you remember back in 1818, there is a joint occupation of Oregon, and the big prize in Oregon is control of the Columbia River for trade. And so what happens is that through the 20s and 30s into the 40s, more and more Americans move to Oregon via the Oregon Trail. And then there is this call for what they called 5440 or fight. 5440 is the parallel of latitude way up in Canada today, where the Oregon country went, and they said, let's get this whole thing or we're going to fight for it. Polk will negotiate in 1846, and actually what will happen is that the border of the 49th parallel will be extended all the way across to the Pacific Ocean, and that is the state of Washington today, the upper limit of the state of Washington, and that's the Oregon Purchase Treaty in 1846. So basically it's cut in half. England gets half, we get half, but we do get control of the Columbia River and the Snake River, which are the big prizes in all that. The big thing, though, is the war with Mexico. The war with Mexico happens to secure this land, this southwestern land, and it is kind of a fabricated war. It's many historians call it the first imperialist war that the United States will fight with a foreign nation, and I, in a lot of ways, I certainly agree with that. So what happens is that it has to do with that issue between the 2 rivers in Texas. where Texas claims that they have the land all the way down to the Rio Grande, and Mexico claims that they have the land all the way up to the Nueces River. So what happens is that Polk will send troops into that land and provoke an altercation, and then he cries, "American blood has been shed on American soil." And that is the rallying cry. Now, interestingly, one of the representatives in the House of Representatives will call him on this. And this is pretty gutsy for this guy because he is a one-term congressman. He's not reelected, but he calls out the president and he says, "Show me the spot where American blood was shed on American soil." He's totally calling out the president. And the president doesn't like this, of course, but it starts to put this kind of unknown character on the radar. This unknown character happens to be Abraham Lincoln. And so this is kind of when he pops onto the national scene briefly with his so-called spot resolution, calling out the president for starting a war without provocation. And so that's what starts the war with Mexico in 1846, the same year as the Oregon Purchase Treaty. And this war will go between 1846 and 1848. And it is like many other wars, there'll be some war heroes and future presidents to come out of this. Zachary Taylor is probably most notable in that regard. And as we talk about the war, the importance of the war is maybe not the fighting, but what comes out of it. What comes out of it is the Mexican cession land, CESS, cession to cede or give by treaty or purchase this land of the Southwest. And that is negotiated through the peace treaty in 1848 called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that's what ends the war. It sets out very clearly that the border is to be very open and very porous between Mexico and the United States. And it has some larger consequences. It leaves a lasting legacy of tension between Mexico and the United States. It opens up this Pandora's box of slavery extension that had been closed for a while since the 1830s. And it opens that up because now we have to talk about extension, right? Are we going to have this area extend slavery as Polk wants, or as many in Congress say, should we not extend slavery in this new territory? David Wilmot, a senator, or a representative, excuse me, will twice put that before the floor in his Wilmot proviso unsuccessfully. It does expand the geography of the United States. By 1848, almost all of the contiguous, what we call the lower 48 today, that land is secured. There's a little portion that the United States will buy in 1853 that will complete it, but that's basically it. And then what one historian has said is that it is the blood-spattered schoolroom of the Civil War, which is a gross way to say that it trained up the young officers who will fight and lead the battles in the Civil War coming up 12 years later. And so that's kind of what is happening with Polk. And I think that if you look at a map and look at all the land that is garnered in the second half of the 1840s, we can see the importance of Polk. We may not agree with him, but we see his importance in all of that. That's where we're going to end today. We will pick it up with some of the other repercussions next time, especially with the gold rush. in California, and then the subsequent California applying for statehood in 1850. And so that's coming up. And so we will see you later, everybody. Have a great day. Take care.